Thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm so excited to be here, and I can't wait to get started, so let's just do it. As you know, this webinar is entitled Awakening to Our Soul Story, and I'm so excited because I've been teaching for so many years, but never really allowed to mention a lot about the soul since I taught within the framework of academic psychology. But our soul is really the key to understanding human behavior. And even the people who named the discipline knew that. When you look at the term psychology alone, psyche translates in, it comes from the Greek word soul. So we are on a soul journey, and we are going to be using the tools of psychology to help us through this. But before we get to that part, I would really like for us to start looking at the symbol. The symbol that I've included in my presentation here is the water lily. And this water lily that you see is, to me, symbolic of who we are. I like the water lily for a number of reasons. For one thing, it has symbolized spiritual enlightenment for thousands of years. And when I chose the water lily, I chose it because I thought of how the water lily itself grows from the depths of the water, from the deep, dark, mysterious, murky water below the surface that none of us can see. And yet what emerges is this beautiful flower, and this multifaceted flower. This flower that really has so many ways in which we can use to look at our own lives to begin to uncover what it would mean for us to awaken to our soul story. So each of these petals to me represent the foundation in a sense. The larger petals on the very bottom represent basically some of the ways in which we can begin to know what it means to awaken, and in a sense what forms the foundation of our development. And then each of the white petals represents facets that we can begin to examine in order to understand the different ways in which we can look at our behavior, and in order to understand how we've gotten to where we are today. So awakening to our soul story is really about reshaping our attitude. And in this particular journey that we're going on in this next hour, we will be talking about waking from our sleep, because the idea that we are awakening implies that we are asleep. And so if we are asleep, I think it's a good idea for us to start looking at the realms in which we are asleep. So if we can look at those different realms, we begin to dissect and reduce what behavior is all about. But the wonderful thing about reductionism is that it allows us to understand more in detail what actually comprises our development. But the thing to remember that is really important also is that we have to piece ourselves back together again. We can't keep ourselves separate and pretend that we can understand who we are by just examining one of the petals. We have to put all the petals back together because we are a whole. We are this flower. So what we're going to be looking at is also that changing our inner, that by opening up to and awakening to our soul story, we will begin to change our inner attitude towards ourselves, towards other people, and towards the world in general. So many of us are critical of ourselves, and a lot of that is just coming from the experiences we've had, and not necessarily grounded in any truth at all. We've judged ourselves because maybe we didn't fit in the way other people wanted us to, or maybe we ourselves were critical that we didn't feel that we were like other people, and so we thought that there was something wrong with us. So hopefully by awakening to our soul story, we will also change that inner attitude that we have towards ourselves so that we're more self-nurturing and more loving. We're also going to be looking at some different processes that are going to help us to remember who we are, who we can become. So a good way to look at awakening is that it is a process. It is not something that is set in stone and that all of a sudden you're going to magically discover this deep person that you are, but to remember that who you are becoming will become a deeper person. So what is our soul story, and how does this soul story differ from the life we are living? You know, when I look at the life we are living, as a psychologist, I end up looking at all the different ways that different theorists have explained to us how we grow to be who we are. And especially when you look at psychological problems, we understand that the different experiences that we have not only help to form our attitudes, but the filters that we develop also create this kind of I guess, preset notion as to who we are. And so we're really not aware to what our soul story is because we haven't discovered it yet. Much of like the work of Bruce Lipton, for example. Bruce Lipton talks a lot about how even before conception, our genes are selected for based upon our parents' perception of the world. So if they live in fear and if they live in anxiety, then the genes that are selected for if and when conception should occur are those genes that are going to help us to survive, but not necessarily to be intelligent. So that's really important to know. And then also in the first 5 years of our life, we are unconscious. As many of you know, not too many of us have memories of that childhood. And one thing Bruce Lipton does also, what he illustrates for us is that we are programmed just like, in a sense, like a robot. In the sense, we take data in, we take information in, we watch our parents, we watch the people around us, and the next thing you know, we're doing it, we're saying the same things. I mean, how many of you have already done that, where you thought that, you know, you found yourself going, oh my God, I sound just like my mom, or oh my God, I sound just like my dad. And you didn't mean to, and you swore that when you were growing up you would never be like them, so to speak. And yet in those moments when we are activated, we find ourselves acting just like we were hoping we would not act. So to me, the life we are living is not necessarily a conscious life, and so our soul story is the story that is an awakened self, where we are awake to those forces and those developmental experiences that have gone in to shape how we see the world and how we see ourselves. So what are the different levels? You know, when we look at the different levels of where we are asleep, I think it's really helpful to do that, because if I can look at the different levels where I'm asleep, then I can begin to do something about it. But first, you know, when I look at how we asleep, you know, how are we asleep? Charles Shar talked about living the mindful life. He said that we are in a waking sleep. His book, Waking Up, Overcoming Obstacles to Human Potential, that really gave me the insight to looking at basically how I could be more mindful. And to be more mindful means to be present in the moment, to be looking at what is happening right now and not filtering it through any preconceived ideas or emotions or experiences that we've had in the past, so that we can meet each new encounter with like a baby. Okay, and that allows us to live less from our ego and personality, and allows us to live more deeply, in a sense that we connect to our soul and we reconnect to our soul when we have actually probably discarded parts of ourselves along the way. So again, waking up, what is the terrain that we will be traveling to capture, recapture, discover, and evolve our soul story? If you look at this picture that I have in front of you, you'll see that it resembles life and death. I guess the one thing missing from this picture for me is the birth process, and if I find the right photo, I'm going to put it in. But right now, I want you to imagine that waking up includes the idea that We wake up to who we were when we were born, who we have become in the process, and also where we're going. Who do we want to become? Who is it? Why were we born? Who is the essence of who we are, and can we discover that by only looking at, our biographical life? I think we have to look at three realms. We have to look at our birth. We have to look at the perinatal uh, time in which we were in the womb. We have to look at the birth process itself. We have to look at our life. We have to look at this multifaceted way of looking at the world. And then we also have to examine our attitudes about death, because our attitudes about death often um, impact very, very strongly, I might add, the way that we do live our life. So I think when we've been brave enough to look at our death, we will live our life more fully and from the heart. When I've put together these realms of the waking sleep, I was really sort of looking at that whole idea that when we're sleeping even, there's a point where a lot of people become lucid in their dreams. And what that means is to be still asleep physically, but that your consciousness takes on a more lucid form, in the sense that you're in the dream and you say, aha, I am awake. I am awake in my dream. This is a dream that I'm having. This is not quote unquote reality. So a lot of us, when we become lucid in our dreams, will start to do other things. We're capable of so much more. And that's the way I see awakening to our soul story, is that it will allow us to be capable of so much more than we are capable of doing when we only live from the ego and the personality. I'm going to go sort of quickly through these realms of the waking sleep, because I'm going to be covering this in a future, in our next seminar, actually, our next webinar. But I wanted to at least outline for you the realms in which I think that we have to explore in order to wake up. For one, there's that nonverbal realm of the unconscious. So, you probably heard about Freud, you've heard about Carl Jung, you've heard about the whole idea that there's this unconscious realm where all our fears and our fantasies and our the things that our traumas, the things that we push down about ourselves get hidden from our conscious self. And we think that because it's out of our conscious mind, that it is out in outer space or somewhere, that it is actually still a part of who we are. And in fact, I really like the way Robert Bly explained this. Robert Bly is a poet, and he said that basically we are like people dragging this bag behind us, and we throw all the things into that bag that we don't want people to know about. So I throw in my fears about myself. I throw in my insecurities. I throw in the memories of any traumas I've had. I throw in, feelings I might have had in order to, that I thought were unacceptable. So I threw them in there. And yet what has happened is that Robert Bly talks about that bag as having a big hole at the bottom. And so as we're walking along, thinking that we're dragging this bag behind us and nobody else can see the things that we're insecure about, that we're afraid that they might see or afraid that we might see, yet they're spilling out behind us. And that is so much the nature of human consciousness and human behavior, is that we are automatically reacting to a lot of the things that happen in the world because we've been conditioned to that. And so just the recognition alone, of course, is not enough to change, but at least it's a beginning. So our nonverbal unconscious, there's three different kinds of unconscious that I want for us to explore. One of them is what I call the nonverbal unconscious. And that nonverbal unconscious is that time period of your development when you were nonverbal, when you didn't have command of language, when you didn't have the vocabulary that you have now to be able to express how you feel, or to be able to identify when something's bothering you, or to be able to think things through. All you did was download. You downloaded information, and it was filtered through your emotions and your body and through your senses. And so things that you encountered that maybe resulted in making you think that they were scary. Like I'll give an example of my mom. My mom was very afraid of birds. and yet we had a little parakeet in our home. And my little brother, which is very funny, I didn't know that he was afraid of birds, but I gave him a bird feeder for his birthday one year, and he goes, "Oh, that's really funny, giving a bird feeder to somebody who's afraid of birds." And I told him, I says, "I didn't know you were afraid of birds." And so I thought about that, and I thought, you know what? I'll bet his fear came from when he must have seen Mom reacting to birds in a very fearful way, so therefore he cataloged birds are scary. Okay? That's just one example. There's so many other things that we pick up when we're um, growing up and when we're watching other people. And it's all nonverbal. Like I said, we don't have command of language, so we only catalog things through our kinesthetic movements. We catalog them through smells, through sight, through sound, um, and through activated emotions. So sometimes our emotions get activated and we don't even know where it comes from, and we can't even place why we feel the way that we do, because in our, at least, memory, the memory that we have access to, we cannot access anything that will tell us what's going on. Okay, so there's that nonverbal realm. There's also that nonverbal realm that Stanislav Grof talks about. Stanislav Grof tells us there's this whole perinatal matrix that we have to look at that also helps to describe what he calls the cartography of the psyche. The cartography of the psyche is not only your conscious self and your unconscious self, and as Carl Jung would say, there were two parts to your unconscious too, but Stanislav Grof talks about the perinatal period as imprinting feelings and emotions that we may not be able to understand later on when we're adults and when we're verbal, because these feelings that we had, these emotions, these chemicals that we were exposed to, if our mother ingested any kind of chemicals or if she was stressed out, those sorts of things impacted our fetal environment, our uterine environment, I should say. So there's that realm that we can explore, and is a realm that I think, especially if you're a therapist or if you are considering going into the profession of becoming a therapist, there are many realms in which a therapist can help a person to unfold and awaken their self. The personal unconscious is that realm of the unconscious that Carl Jung described and which Sigmund Freud described. They were both similar in the sense that Freud only believed that there was one type of unconscious, where there were layers in the unconscious, where some things were more accessible than others, but there was only the unconscious that is part of your biographical life. So there's nothing in your unconscious that didn't get put there during your lifetime. And so there's that whole realm that we need to look at, the realm of experience, the realm of what has happened to you, what you needed, what you wanted, and what didn't happen, and how that goes into the personal unconscious and creates the kinds of I'll use Jung's term of complexes. It creates the kind of complexes that we have to life. So if you have a feeling of inferiority, you might be able to trace it back to a time when, you were a kid and all your parents could say is that you'll never amount to anything. And so in our personal unconscious, that kind of programming, when we're young, we believe everything that we're told. So there's Jean Piaget's cognitive theory tells us that when we're below age 6, we're still in that pre-operational world. We're in that pre-operational world where it's symbolic, where we're egocentric, where the world really revolves around us. So, for example, if something happens, like let's say your parents got divorced when you were below age 5, no doubt you probably blamed yourself on some level for the split up. You probably thought, it was because of me, it's because one time I was mad at Mom and Dad, and I wish that, that they weren't here, and then all of a sudden it comes true. Well, the magical thinking of a preoperational child is going to be that yes, it is not it it is because of that. But the truth is that no, it was not your fault, and that's why parents have to be really careful to let people know, their children know that it's not their fault when something like that happens. And then last of all, the collective unconscious, that's really the very interesting realm. And we're not, like I said, we're not going to get into this in detail, but I think I've gone into a lot of detail already. But the collective unconscious is that part of your unconscious that we inherit from the collective human race. So there's all sorts of preformed ways of reacting to the world that we don't even have to see somebody do this, and we've already got the program within us as to how we're going to react. For example, like becoming a wife or becoming a husband. You've never been a husband or a wife before, and yet the archetype of becoming a wife or becoming a husband is already set for us in our culture. Our culture expects husbands and wives to act certain ways. They expect husbands and wives to act differently from than boyfriends and girlfriends. Okay? So the archetypes are as many as there are situations for a human being, and probably the most popular archetypes are the persona, the shadow, the anima, and the animus, and those are the ones that we'll talk about in our next seminar. The other realms that we need to talk about are, of course, the biological realm, what you were born with, your genetics, um, and basically, I love what Bruce Lipton has been telling us about this, and that is basically that the genetics that we have inherited are not written in stone because those genes still need to be activated. And we used to think that the the fact that you had the gene alone would spell that you would eventually have that disease if it was a disease. But now we know that it is the nurturing, it is the environmental forces that activate the genetic uh, expression. And so there's a lot going on in psychoneuroimmunology where we're beginning to discover that there is more to the unfolding of our genetics than we used to believe. The evolutionary forces that impact our behavior are those behaviors that come from the adaptability of those behaviors, and because those characteristics and those kinds of behaviors were selected for when people chose partners, they got passed on to us. So therefore, if we look down there at gender, and we look at evolution in the sense of how gender behavior is impacted by the evolutionary forces, we begin to understand that men and women were selected for different reasons. Men were selected for their ability to provide, their ability to be able to protect, and the woman was selected for her ability to bear young and to nurture and to keep, in a sense, to keep the group together. So there are those forces, and then if we look at our family and our culture and society, those three realms alone are so strong that it takes the things that we all have in common and makes them even more individual in the sense that our families are all different from one another. And even if you grew up in the same family as your siblings, right, you'll notice that you're nothing like your siblings. You probably wonder, how in the world did I get into the same family as my brother? He's so different from me. Um, and yet we know that we know that our family is different.